All right, I think we can get started now. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to DEP's webinar on the Natural Working Land Strategy. I'm Heather Genovich, a research scientist in the Division of Science and Research at New Jersey DEP, and I've had the pleasure of working with an incredible team from across the department on developing the Natural and Working Land Strategy. This is our fourth and final stakeholder meeting on the strategy. So far, we've covered wetlands and aquatic habitats, developed land, and agriculture. Today, we're going to go over the targets or goals that we have developed for forests. And we're here to get feedback from all of you, many of whom work in the forestry field. The primary purpose of the strategy that we're here to discuss is to maximize carbon sequestration in New Jersey's natural and working lands. When I first started on this project, the term working lands was new to me, so if anybody else is uncertain what that means, working lands include farms, certain forests, and any other lands from which we get products. In the strategy, we will lay out specific actions that can maximize sequestration on public lands. There will also be some opportunities for private lands as well. Before we really dig in, I want to let everybody know that the meeting is being recorded, and we will post the recordings on our website along with the presentation materials. We plan to get those up by the end of next week, so keep an eye out on the NWLS website. The last time I checked, we had around 230 people registered for this meeting, and that includes foresters, conservation groups, environmental consultants, government agencies, universities, and more. And we're really pleased to have folks here from all these sectors to help guide the strategy. Before we proceed, I want to cover a few ground rules. We are using the webinar format in Teams. Now that means that attendee microphones and cameras are off by default. You can provide comments or ask questions in the chat at any time, but we ask that you please limit discussion to the topics that we are covering today. There will be a time for folks to raise their hands and ask questions verbally after we present each land type. I'll call on people one at a time and temporarily turn on your microphone. Then on your end, you'll also need to turn it on. Now, our main purpose for being here today is to share the progress we've made on the strategy and to hear from you. We will consider every bit of input that we receive, but we will not issue a response document. After these 4 meetings, we're going to take back your comments, integrate them where appropriate, and continue writing the strategy. And we plan to release the final strategy late in the third quarter of 2023. If you find that you have additional comments for us after the meeting, there is a comment form on our website, and I'll give you some more details on that later in the talk. So again, my name is Heather Genovich. Up next, we'll hear from Tony Rowe on the impetus for the strategy and how it fits in with DEP's climate initiatives. Mattia Jepsen will give an overview of what will be in the strategy and how we developed our targets. And Mattia will be followed by Lauren Seclair, who will go over the targets for forests. You can type your comments or questions in the chat at any time, but we'll wait to call on raised hands until after Lauren finishes her slides. And then I'll wrap up the meeting with a focus on what's next and how you can review the targets and submit comments online. So now I'm going to pass the mic to Tony Rowe.
Thanks, Heather. Going to take control. Just as Heather said, I'm just going to talk about the background about how all this came to be. So the state's climate action is guided by 3 major greenhouse gas reduction goals. It's governed by the Global Warming Response Act and the New Jersey Executive Order 273. And this calls for Jersey to do a few things. One, it's to reduce the statewide greenhouse gas emissions to the year 1990 levels, which is about 112 million metric tons of CO2 equivalent by year 2020. The second goal is to reduce the statewide emissions by 50% by year 2006 levels. That's approximately 60 million metric tons of CO2 by 2030. And the third reduction goal is to reduce it by 80% below the 2006 year mark, which is an additional 24 million metric tons by year 2050. However, meeting these ambitious goals of reducing emissions by 50% in the year 2030 and 80% by year 2050, we will require an economy-wide transformation that demands all economic sectors, government levels, companies, communities, and individuals to accept and adopt fundamental changes in how we consume energy, reduce waste, and interact with our natural lands. A quick update about those 3 reduction goals. Jersey did accomplish the first one by achieving its 2020 mark of reducing those greenhouse gases by year 1990. But of course, we still have lots to do for the ambitious goals for year 2030 and year 2050. So great for Jersey. Next, so in 2020, DEP released this report. It's called the Global Warming Response Act 80 by 50 report, and it outlines some key things here. 1, it identifies the pathways to achieve the 80 by 50 reduction goals. 2, it evaluates 7 emission sectors of New Jersey's economy and models how the state can achieve reductions in those sectors. And the 3rd is it provides specific policy recommendations for those actions. So in that report, in summary, the report lays out 4 major pathways to greenhouse gas emissions or reducing them. First and foremost is replacing fossil fuel vehicles and with electric vehicles, so electrification. Second is to convert space and water heating in the residential and commercial building sectors to electric heat. And third, replacing fossil fuels in the electric power generation sector with renewable energy sources. But even if we achieve all 3 of these major transitions, New Jersey will not reach its greenhouse gas reduction goals without significant protection of our natural working lands. So carbon sequestration is needed to offset our gross emissions. So more reports. So in addition to that, DEP released a series of reports and plans to identify and address the impacts of climate change. A common thread is the role of the state's natural working lands to address climate change. So a quick summary about all these 7 major reports. So the first is a 2020 science report on climate change, which identifies the impacts of natural lands from climate change. The second, the 2020 Global Warming Response Act, identifies the role that carbon sequestration will play in achieving these reductions. The 2020 RGGI Strategic Funding Plan, this is an important one, identifies a steady stream of funding to enhance the state's natural working lands. The 2021 Climate Resiliency Strategy identifies the role of nature-based solutions to support these resiliency goals. Also, the New Jersey Wetlands Program and the Forest Action Plans both evaluate the role of these lands that provide in protecting carbon sequestration. Now, at the center of it all, the Natural Working Land Strategy Report. It furthers these efforts by strengthening the state's commitment to protecting and enhancing the carbon pools, or the sinks, of these natural lands through the adoption of carbon sequestration targets that we're going to talk about today for forests, and identifying actionable management practices. So this strategy will in turn be utilized as a feedback loop to inform future iterations of all these plans, the development of incentive programs and regulatory policies. And I believe that's it. So I'm going to hand it off to Mattia for the next round.
Thank you, Tony. So first I wanted to just give a quick overview of carbon sequestration basics. So plants pull carbon dioxide from the air as part of photosynthesis, and that carbon is stored in the leaves and roots of the plant. As the leaves and other parts of the plants die, that gets incorporated into the soil. The living and dead plant material, plus fungus and microbial biomass, are all considered to be sequestered carbon. Some of that stored carbon is re-released into the atmosphere when plants and microbes respire, and it can be released as carbon dioxide, methane, or other gases. When natural and working lands are disturbed by natural or human activities, there can be a decrease in how fast carbon is stored, or there can be an increase in the re-emission of stored carbon back into the atmosphere as greenhouse gases. Land management strategies can be used to protect stored carbon and to increase the rate of carbon storage. So as far as natural and working lands, we have broken them up into several different types. So we are looking at forests, which we're talking about today, agriculture, wetlands, developed lands, and aquatic habitats. We had meetings on the other habitat types over last week and the week before. All of those meetings are recorded and will be available on the website in the very near future. So in order to help jumpstart land management practices that will increase carbon sequestration, DEP has been working with the New Jersey Department of Agriculture for the past 2 years to draft an evolving natural and working land strategy. The strategy will identify actions that can mitigate the impacts of climate change through carbon storage and sequestration. The strategy includes specific land management practices, ideas for program development, and ideas for policies that can be implemented by state agencies to protect stored carbon and increase carbon sequestration in New Jersey's natural and working lands. In this way, the state will be in a better position to meet the 80 by 50 emissions targets that Tony discussed. The recommendations in the natural and working land strategy are expected to be broadly applicable to other groups that manage land, not just state organizations. So landowners and land managers, nonprofits, universities, and policymakers from all jurisdictions are also key audiences for the strategy. So in terms of the milestones, where we started and where we're going, the natural and working land strategy was kicked off in the spring of 2021. We released a scoping document that detailed what we were intending to do and how we plan to go about it, and received feedback from the public at that point. And during that process, we also asked for any ideas of what should be included, any literature that we should be looking at, any existing plans. And we then used that information and other information that our work groups developed to build a list of recommendations and to develop targets. So now we're in the stakeholdering process where we are reaching out to public stakeholder groups to see what they think of these recommendations and targets, to see what we've missed, if there's anything that people think shouldn't be in there, if they have any suggestions about partnerships or funding opportunities. And we'll incorporate that information, as Heather mentioned, and release a final strategy towards the end of 2023. So how was the strategy developed? So first, besides the materials that we collected from the public during stakeholdering, we collected natural and working land strategy type documents from around the state, around the country, around the world. We wanted to see what other people's strategies looked like. And there were some really good examples out there, like North Carolina, California, and I think Connecticut. So we pulled the recommendations from those existing strategies and made a giant list of potential policies and land management activities and programmatic and programs that we might be able to develop in New Jersey. Next, we put together a series of work groups. So we had a forestry work group and an agricultural work group and a wetlands work group. So we took experts from within DEP and the Department of Agriculture, and they honed that list. They took that massive list of hundreds of ideas and honed it for what seemed to be most appropriate for New Jersey. Once we had a slightly more manageable list, we dug into the literature and looked for modeling that could tell us what the carbon benefit of those activities would be. We also thought about the cost of those activities and the scalability. And by scalability, I mean, is this something that we can do on 1 acre? Or is this something that we could do on hundreds of acres across the state? How applicable is this? Because we had so many different land management activities and so many different habitat types, we weren't able to do a thorough modeling of what the benefits would be, but we wanted to make sure that whatever we selected had a strong scientific underpinning to support the idea that these land management practices would definitely have net carbon sequestration. So the groups put those together, and then based off of the carbon benefit, the cost, the scalability, we developed our list of recommendations. So we selected policy recommendations and land management recommendations. And then we filled out a series of worksheets on those to try to think about who would implement them, exactly, what are we talking about with that recommendation? Where can we implement it? When? Why would we do it? How? We also filled out information about impediments to implementing the recommendation. We thought about the impacts to overburdened communities. We thought about how climate change might impact these land management strategies. And we also thought about other benefits of these activities to ecosystems and people, both in terms of the benefits, and we want to make sure that any of the land management strategies that we're recommending still support a strong ecology. It's, we're not looking for just one-sided answers. And then we developed targets for each one of those recommendations, and we set the targets at 2030 and 2050 to be in line with that 80 by 50 report. And I think now I'll turn it over to Heather, and then we can get into the targets for forestry. Thank you.
Thanks, Mattia. I'm just going to answer one quick question in the chat about how much of this history is available on the website. And I'm going to assume that refers to what Mattia just described on the last slide. So that will be the text of the strategy. That's how we got to this list of recommendations that we're sharing today. The full list is currently available on the website. So before we move on to the targets, I have some questions that I want you to keep in the back of your mind while you're listening. In particular, we want to know what might be missing from our draft list of targets. Now, please remember that any practices you suggest must have published scientific literature that confirms a net carbon sequestration benefit. We want to know if you see any targets that don't belong on these lists, and we want to hear why that is the case. To improve the chances of succeeding in meeting the targets, we need to identify and address key obstacles to achieving them. What obstacles do you foresee? And we also know these changes will come at a cost. We'll need to pair funding mechanisms with our targets, so we want to hear about any potential sources of funding that you might be aware of. And now I'm going to hand the mic off to Lauren.
Hey, Lauren, you're muted. Sorry.
Thank you. Sorry about that, guys. Thanks, Heather. And hi, everyone. I'm Lauren Seclair, and I am the Carbon and Climate Forester for the New Jersey Forest Service, and I am the team lead for the Natural Working Lands Forest land type. Today, I'm going to be sharing the forestry targets for 10 different recommendations that are associated with 60 different targets. So we're going to cover a lot of information. You're going to hear me do a lot of talking, so apologies for that. But before we get into the targets, I want to do a quick introduction of forested land and carbon in New Jersey. So there are an estimated 1.9 million acres of forested land in New Jersey, and New Jersey is about 40% forested. And those forested lands are split between several different owners, including federal government, which owns 6% of forested lands, state government, which owns 33%, county and municipal local governments who own 15%, and then private lands who own 46% of all forested lands in the state. So you can see this map on the right. All of the green areas are forested and all of the beige areas are non-forested. According to the U.S. Forest Service Forest Inventory and Analysis data, New Jersey forests store about 1.41 million metric tons of carbon dioxide. And when we look at tons of carbon per acre across the state, we get this map here on the right, with the darker gray and black areas having the most tons of carbon per acre and the lighter gray and white areas having the least tons of carbon per acre. And when we highlight those areas that have the most carbon per acre, we can see that they cover the highlands, the sourlands, and the pinelands, which are also the areas in the state that are the most densely forested. In New Jersey, we collect data for forest carbon from 5 different carbon pools, which are reservoirs of carbon. And these pools include the above ground live pool, which has live plants, tree stems, branches, and leaves. The below ground live pool, which has all of our roots of live plants. The deadwood pool, which has all standing and fallen dead wood, logs, and dead branches. The litter pool, which includes all leaves, needles, seeds, and fruits that have fallen to the forest floor, and the soil pool. Our two largest carbon pools are the above ground live pool and the soil pool, which make up 78% of all of our forest carbon. And now that I've covered some of the background information, I'm going to jump right into our recommendations and targets. So we'll start off with our management recommendations, and I'm going to describe how we're defining each management recommendation and then follow with the targets for that recommendation. Now, it's important to address that there's a time and a place for each of these recommendations to be implemented, and not all of these recommendations are going to be appropriate at any individual site or in different parts of the state. Forestry is very site specific, so keep that in mind. So afforestation is our first recommendation, and that establishes forests on sites that were previously non-forested and expands the overall carbon pools by establishing more forest. For this strategy, abandoned agricultural land and other non-forested lands would be our focus. For this recommendation, we'd like to focus on identifying and planting non-forested lands to a forested condition and private lands incentives for afforestation projects. Essentially, we'd like to set a target of afforesting about 200 acres per year, and we're recommending this annualized target through 2050 because there's potentially limited land available for afforestation. So you have to remember that even if there are acres of non-forested land that are available, they might not be suitable for growing forests due to site conditions or because that land has a different ecological purpose that it's fulfilling. We'd also like to make sure that we're selecting appropriate species that will be well adapted to future climate conditions when we're afforesting properties. We want to continue the internal DEP process of land management reviews on state lands to ensure that sites are actually suitable for afforestation. We want to create afforestation-specific best management practices and eventually begin the process of afforesting state-owned golf courses, abandoned bogs like cranberry bogs, and other similar lands. So next up is avoiding conversion, which is the concept of keeping forests as forests. So keeping forests growing at any age maintains the continued existence of a forest carbon pool. And avoided conversion strategies are appropriate for forested lands that are at risk of being developed or converted from a forested to a non-forested condition. For this recommendation, we want to focus on avoiding conversion of forested lands to non-forest uses. This is something that we think is really important when it comes to carbon storage and sequestration because things like development eliminate stored carbon in trees as well as any future sequestration potential of those trees. Unfortunately, this one's a little bit bigger than the DEP because state lands aren't often sold off to be developed, so this target relies really heavily on private landowners not selling or fragmenting their land. This is why we're hoping to maintain the current level of conversion at about 4,000 acres per year and hopefully be able to lower that rate to about 2,000 acres per year by 2050. Ways that we can help to avoid conversion on private lands includes continuing to grow our private lands forest stewardship program and by increasing the acreage of land that's purchased by DEP's Green Acres program. Next up, we have avoiding emissions. And avoiding emissions by protecting forest carbon pools is a strategy that's focused on preventing catastrophic carbon losses from forests due to events like widespread impacts from invasive insects or disease or from wildfires. So this strategy lowers the volatility in forest carbon pools rather than increasing the amount of carbon that's being directly stored. Activities that help to avoid emission generally work by lowering forest stress through low to moderate disturbances like thinning and prescribed burning. And just as a heads up, this recommendation would be applicable only in areas that are prone to large disturbances like wildfires or bark beetle outbreaks. So we have 3 targets here, and all of them are high priorities for the Forest Service, my agency, and strategies that we are already implementing. So strategic placement of forest thinnings and prescribed burns in wildfire-prone areas can help to reduce competition within our forests, which lowers stress and decreases tree vulnerability to insects like different bark beetles. Thinning also helps to reduce ladder fuels that can carry a wildfire from the forest floor into the tree crowns. And our recommended 1,500 acres of thinning per year It's limited due to contractor constraints. There are only about 2 to 3 contractors in the state that are capable of doing larger scale forestry projects. And then our prescribed burn targets here are the average for what the New Jersey Forest Fire Service is able to burn in a given year. And that takes into account the potential burn days are really limited by weather. Our forest health program currently surveys for an assortment of damage-causing agents across the state, but it would be really great to grow this program to be able to survey more sites each year. So to reiterate a little through this last recommendation here, the prescribed burn and the thinning targets are mostly South Jersey-based, Pinelands-based, those areas that are prone to wildfires and bark beetle outbreaks, and the forest health target would be applicable to the entire state. Okay. So for the purpose of this document, we're looking at improved forest management as a recommendation to help increase data accuracy and abundance, to make sure contracts and plans are well written and efficient in scope, and to carry out planned management. So knowing what we have on the ground helps us to better implement management to increase our forest health, which is in turn beneficial to forest carbon by stabilizing carbon pools, potentially increasing sequestration by minimizing competition stress, and making our carbon estimates more accurate. So these targets will all help us to continue to have up-to-date data by enhancing our FIA, which is our Forest Inventory and Analysis Agreement, to include phase 3, which are understory plots, and continuing to do smaller scale annual inventories of at least 40,000 acres across all of our state lands, our state forest lands. That data is going to help make our forest management optimization model more accurate, and we're hoping to use that model to help guide management planning decisions on the ground and to better be able to assess trade-offs between different management practices. We'd like to set targets to continue providing predictive forest management opportunities that are consistent with the New Jersey State Forest Action Plan, which is a federally mandated plan that's rewritten every 10 years. To plan new ecological forest management with new natural resource stewardship plans, and then to finish the last 2,700 acres of approved and permitted management under the Double Trouble State Park Natural Resource Stewardship Plan. Our next recommendation is reforestation, which establishes young forests that can rapidly sequester carbon from the air. This strategy will be used to reestablish prior forests or will encourage forest development on sites that are having problems regenerating naturally. I know that reforestation and forest restoration are different things, but we're trying to make these recommendations broad, so we've kind of mushed them together in this instance. So we're looking at forest restoration as a broad strategy that involves repairing ecosystem function, which allows forests to grow and sequester carbon in places where that forest's ability to sequester efficiently or to transfer carbon between pools has been compromised. The targets we want to focus on here include assessing the regeneration status of forest lands that have been affected by damage-causing agents, surveying state lands to identify areas where ecosystem function is disrupted, prioritizing sites for reforestation actions, and identifying and restoring degraded forests, 800 acres by 2030 and 2,000 acres by 2050 to an ecologically functional state. All 4 of these targets are impactful when it comes to carbon because a healthy forest is going to sequester and store more carbon. It's going to be resilient to damage from insects, disease, fires, storms, droughts. And then because forest regeneration is really important to the future of that forest carbon. Our next recommendation is nurturing forests with the New Jersey Forest Service Nursery. And the New Jersey Forest Service Nursery produced approximately 300,000 bare root trees and shrubs in 2019. The New Jersey Forest Service works, or the nursery works with more than 5,800 applicants participating in private lands management that have woodland management plans and forest stewardship plans that cover more than 250,000 acres. So providing bare root nursery stock to woodland owners and those that are seeking to create woodlands on their properties aids in carbon sequestration. The targets we want to focus on for this recommendation are making sure that what we're choosing to plant are species that are resilient to future climate change and working on establishing nursery production of trees that are resistant or resilient to invasive insects and pathogens. From a carbon perspective, we want to plant species that are going to thrive and remain resilient under future climate conditions. So paying attention to species range shifts and individual tree resistance to pathogens is a really great way to do that. We would also like to increase nursery production to annually service more private landowners and state-led reforestation and forest restoration projects, as production at our nursery was unfortunately negatively impacted by COVID-19. Our next recommendation is providing outreach and education that's focused on educating New Jersey citizens and landowners on the value of forest management. My apologies, this recommendation got split into 2 slides, so just try and bear with me on this one. So the thought behind this recommendation is that the more aware citizens are about the importance of forest management and how it fits in with the state's natural working lands and emissions targets, the more support we'll be able to garner in implementing these kinds of management. So we hope to improve management-related outreach, programming, and curriculums at existing state interpretive facilities and present 10 New Jersey Forest Service-led forest management programs annually. We want to increase the geographical reach of our forestry programs to be accessible to citizens that are living in all parts of the state and not just close to interpretive centers or park offices. We are currently in the process of adding a DEP webpage that's dedicated specifically to forest carbon and climate management as it relates to forests. We want to make sure that the importance of active forest management and forest health are included in all carbon sequestration messaging to the public, hold at least 4 public events focused on forestry each year, and utilize and enhance relationships with internal stakeholders and partners to expand and enhance opportunities for outreach and education. We would also like to develop and implement a New Jersey Forest Service interpretive plan that can help us to engage a wider audience both geographically and technologically. And finally, we would love to establish a forestry cooperative with the state's land grant institution to help us teach the importance of forest management across the state. Okay, our next recommendation is to promote urban forests and street trees through stewardship in order to maintain and grow the current carbon resource in urban communities. So urban and community forests are really cool. They're capable of doing a kind of double duty to reduce atmospheric carbon. So they sequester it directly, but they can also avoid emissions through energy savings in the built environment. The targets that we want to prioritize here include the continuation and growth of our urban and community forestry program, adding more municipalities to the program each year, providing annual grants for planting and resiliency to municipalities, and then ensuring that those municipalities are well trained and in compliance with their approved plans. We also want to maintain our urban FIA, again, Forest Inventory and Analysis Agreement, which will be receiving our first full urban data set from next year, and to implement a statewide inventory program where data collection amongst municipalities is consistent and suitable for larger scale analysis. We would like to revisit the No Net Loss program and the capacity to hire additional full-time employees. And our biggest target here is to have all municipalities enrolled in our urban stewardship program in the next 20 years. And finally, we want to increase the participation of overburdened communities by 50 communities by 2030 and 100 by 2050 in regard to tree planting, training and education, planning and management, and inventory. So our final management recommendation here is to maintain and increase carbon storage through durable forest products sourced from local markets. So we totally understand New Jersey does not have a very active forest products market, and we absolutely recognize that New Jersey's forest would not be able to produce enough wood to provide for all of its residents. But being able to produce and source local wood and other local forest products could be really beneficial from a global carbon standpoint, by minimizing the carbon footprint associated with shipping goods and by reducing dependence on imported goods that could be negatively affected by supply chain issues. For this recommendation, our first target is revisiting our in-plan study, which is an economic impact data study for New Jersey, to review what wood products are being transported into the state and what those products are being used for. We'd also like to maintain and update our forest industry professionals list in New Jersey, maintain our working relationships with organizations that support local forest products, and support and collaborate with businesses that are interested in starting niche forest product markets in the state. Finally, we'd like to improve consumer awareness of the New Jersey grown agricultural designations for wood products to help combat carbon leakage by keeping products more local. So that's it for our management targets, and I am going to quickly move through our policy targets, most of which will fall under the same recommendations I described in the past few slides. We're only going to have one brand new recommendation in this section. So back to afforestation. Under this recommendation, we have policy targets focused on expanding the urban and community forestry grants program for urban tree planting and maintenance, maintaining our private lands forest management incentive programs, which can include afforestation projects on private lands, coordinating with the New Jersey Fish and Wildlife Connecting Habitats Across New Jersey program to afforest high priority habitats and corridors, and by incentivizing Green Acres and New Jersey Agriculture to afforest their properties where it's appropriate to do so. Under the avoided conversion recommendation, we'd like to implement forest carbon markets on 75,000 acres of state lands by 2030. We're currently in progress to start this process, and we didn't want to set a numerical target for carbon markets for 2050 because we just don't know what the markets are going to look like in the future, so that number will be dependent on market conditions. We would also like to get carbon markets that can be applicable to private landowners established in the state by 2030. So there are a few different private lands carbon markets, like the Family Forest Carbon Program and NCX, that are not yet operational in the state of New Jersey and currently aren't set up to work well with smaller land holdings, which is what most of our New Jersey residents have. So we're hoping to establish a working relationship with some of these different markets so that they're ready to work with New Jersey landowners once those markets hit the state. Under the reforestation recommendation, we have a target for continuing to encourage reforestation and forest restoration on private lands through our private lands incentive program. All right, next up, we have the only recommendation you haven't heard yet, and that is supporting programs that provide incentives to landowners for improved forest management. Incentives can persuade private landowners to keep their forests as forests, and in our private lands program, incentives are rewarded in the form of property tax breaks. So incentives leave the maintenance and administrative costs to the private landowner, but encourage them to manage the forest in a way that's consistent with state and national priorities. For this recommendation, we want to focus on continuing the trend of growth in our private lands program. Having landowners keep their forests as forests and managing them to be healthy is a really excellent way for us to increase carbon stores and potential sequestration on private lands. Additionally, we want to be able to provide cost sharing to properties that are interested in implementing improved forest management using RGGI or Regional Greenhouse Gas Initiative funding. Our ultimate target here would be to have all eligible private properties enrolled in our private land stewardship programs by the year 2050. Now, our final policy targets fall under the recommendation for maintaining and increasing carbon storage through durable forest products sourced from local forests. And these targets are again bigger than DEP. We're hoping to be able to incentivize and eventually subsidize keeping harvested wood out of landfills, update building codes to incentivize the use of emerging carbon positive construction materials such as mass timber in place of steel or concrete. And we would also like to incentivize the creation of local forest products and support the creation of a New Jersey state chapter of the Urban Wood Network. So I know that was a huge amount of information to digest. I definitely need to chug a lot of water after that. So thank you for bearing with me on those. I'm going to turn this back over to Heather so she can remind everyone of what kind of feedback we're looking for, and then we can start by taking some comments and some clarifying questions.
Thanks so much, Lauren. I'm just going to put those slides up again real quick. All right, it looks like we have a lot of action in the chat. So I'm going to go back up here to Robert Moss had a question about why the transcript will not be made available to the general public. That's not something that we typically do, posting transcripts, but we do plan to post the recording of the meeting. We're also going to put the PowerPoint slides up, so you should have access to that. Check our website. By the end of next week, everything should be available. We have a question from Charlie about expected additionality as a result of the projects. And does the implementation avoid deforestation? And I believe the answer is yes to both of those.
I'll just add in to that these recommendations are not projects themselves. They're more broad recommendations that we would create projects under.
Thank you. Ken asked a question about 1.41 per acre. That was back on slide 12. I'm just going to put that up here. Here it is. Lauren, did you want to touch on that?
Yeah, so that 1.41 million metric tons of carbon dioxide, that's what forests across the entire state sequester. But this map that I had on the right that I was telling you guys about, this map, the units are carbon, tons of carbon per acre. So sorry for not clarifying that.
Yeah, and I was just going to point out one thing with that, Lauren, because when that got asked, I was going to answer that right away. But I just checked it in the data set, and it's actually that's not carbon CO2 equivalent. That's tons of carbon in the 5 pools, and it's 140, almost 142 million metric tons. Just FYI, just the decimal was moved over too. But that's across all the pools.
So there's a few questions here that could fall under the forest management plan umbrella. Some folks are asking what plans call for prescribed burns or allow that, when logging can be a part of it, or where proforestation fits in. So maybe you could just give like a broad overview of how your management plans work and, you know, how the different pieces sort of fit in.
Yeah, that's again a really broad question, but I'll try my best to hit all of the points in it. So like I said in the beginning, forestry is really site specific. So individual management plans are going to be really dependent on the site. So we already do a ton of inventory across state lands, at least. So we take inventory data, we do full analysis on the condition of the forest, and then we would try and prescribe management based on those specific conditions for that specific site. Prescribed burning can be a part of those management plans on rotation. I know that the Forest Fire Service has sites that they already have in rotation for prescribed burns, especially throughout the pinelands. Whereas proforestation is concerned, that has definitely been a controversial forestry topic in the past few years. The term proforestation hasn't yet been recognized by the IPCC or NIACS, which is the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science. But I will say New Jersey is one of the only states in the nation that actually discusses and acknowledges proforestation within our State Forest Action Plan. Again, those are federally mandated plans that each state has to submit. And the terminology on proforestation isn't yet clearly defined, but I do want to say, especially it's in our action plan, we are trying to explore it as an option. And proforestation values, again, the recommendations that I presented today are pretty broad recommendations. But we'd like to think that the values associated with proforestation are included under some of those broader categories, like improved forest management or in our avoided conversion recommendations.
There's another question from Jamie Evans about whether these goals and targets include activities on federal lands. Was that part of your consideration when looking at quantities?
So I did not consider that when I was doing these quantities. These quantities were essentially based off of what contractors in the state that we're aware of are capable of doing or what DEP staffing would allow for. But we would love to work with some more of the federal folks to kind of hone in or refine some of these targets as they're written.
And Lauren, I can echo that for the other land types too. We did not include federal lands in these targets. So if there's opportunities for partnerships, like we have heard from a few people from Department of Defense on the calls that, you know, there's land and funding and, you know, other ways that they can assist with this. We're certainly interested in those partnerships.
I should also point out to Department of Defense in particular is particularly active in terms of like fire mitigation, because you know they have bases near populated areas where wildfire prone forests occur. So they have, you know, there has been some partnership there, but yes, that certainly could be expanded upon. Thanks.
It looks like we have a question raised. Let's go to Emil. We will allow your mic and you can turn on your microphone on your end as well.
Neil DeVito, New Jersey Conservation Foundation. So in terms of looking to the future and in terms of looking to make sure our forests are regenerating, I never heard anyone mention deer. I'm really concerned because our Atlantic white cedar swamps in many places don't regenerate because if they're not fenced. Oak forests in the Pine Barrens don't seem to be regenerating. The project at Magnolia Road is coming up all pine, and the oak plantings are not successful because of deer. New Jersey outside the Pine Barrens is a travesty. All forest gaps are not regenerating properly, so the future forest is looking pretty meager. And currently, the Division of Fish and Wildlife purports that the only way to regenerate forest is to cut it down and create seed tree harvests and other huge sunlit gaps, which alter the forest composition and bring in invasive species. So I'm really worried that this entire project, since no one is, for the past 45 years, no one is challenging the Division of Fish and Wildlife to actually control the deer in New Jersey, that none of this is going to work. That the forests of northern New Jersey, gap by gap, insect by insect, tree fall by tree fall, are not going to regenerate into anything that's going to be sequestering carbon long into the future.
Yeah, Emil, I totally understand.
I'm just really worried that we're not paying attention and we're not keeping our eye on the ball. And the Division of Fish and Wildlife is being completely, what's the word I'm looking for? Just incomprehensibly bad in terms of dealing with reality. Thank you.
Yeah, I totally understand your concern there, Emil, and I'm glad you actually mentioned the deer aspect, because I actually only realized a few days ago as I was reading through all these recommendations again that that was something that we had failed to include. So I'm happy that you brought that up, and that's something that we are definitely looking to add into these recommendations. To help with regeneration. We do want to ensure that there is regeneration coming up in these forests. Like I said, if there's no regeneration, we're not going to have a very good continuation of carbon sequestration. So definitely something we can add into this, or we'll look to add into this document.
Yeah, I also just want to point out just one other piece to that is New Jersey is also one of a handful of states now that led the way on now what's a national effort. But we have we actually take statewide regen surveys, and we're monitoring regen, and we watch that response, and we've seen what happens as a result of deer. So some of the very well-known studies in the Northeast were piloted here. So I did want to point that out. We do actually monitor that pretty carefully, and its impact on regeneration and carbon pools.
Thanks. So Lauren, there was a question in the chat asking if you could explain a little bit more about what is meant by carbon markets.
Oh, yeah. So carbon markets, again, a big topic. There are a few different kinds. So there are voluntary carbon markets, which is what we would be doing in New Jersey. And then there are carbon markets that you would be required to pay into. So essentially, you can think like there are different companies, factories, things like that, that are emitting a certain amount of greenhouse gases would be required to pay into a carbon market, and then funding from those markets could be used for different things. So with a voluntary carbon market, essentially, we would inventory an area. We could sell those carbon credits. So once an area or a stand or a forested area is within a market, that market would then monitor how much carbon is being sequestered and stored in that forest from the beginning of the project to the end. And then they could essentially sell those credits to other organizations that are looking to be a little greener. So we have land available in the state that we could implement in forest carbon markets. They're used for a variety of different things. Sometimes they're used as an incentive to like increase rotation length. They could be helpful in that. yeah, they help to keep land from being developed. So there are a few perks to being in the market. And if we were to make any profit off of that, that would go back into forest restoration projects.
Thank you. We'll head back to the raised hands here to Sarah Webb. We're going to go ahead and allow your mic if you could turn it on your end.
All right. All right. Can you hear me now?
Yep.
I can.
Oh, good. Well, thank you. So thank you so much. There's a lot of good ideas here. I am very concerned, though, about the misinformation feeding this idea that we're going to have better carbon sequestration and storage by creating more young forest, by managing, by removing and thinning established trees. The carbon sequestration, and the data are so clear, is so much greater for mature, large native trees than for young forests. And I know this Young Forest Initiative has legs of its own, but the science, if you look at it, is very clear. We should not be doing that. And if we clear our mature forests using forestry practices and best practices, we will not get a new forest. As Emile DeVito pointed out, our deer will eat anything new that we grow. And I also want to point out that this kind of forest management that's traditional, that in the view of many of us needs to be changed and do less of, is really not going to lead to storage of carbon in forest products. Forest products have a very limited lifespan. Again, there's been scientific analysis, published research on this, which I'm happy to share, that shows that our forest products are very short-lived. A huge amount of carbon is lost in transport, milling, and also the short life of our forest products, including houses, which only last on average maybe 50 years, believe it or not. So this is not a viable way to store carbon by harvesting our wood and using and making products out of the wood, especially not to harvest wood and to use it as fuel, of course, because the carbon goes right back. But I just want to emphasize this point, that the larger trees and our established mature forests are our best defense against climate change, and to have this kind of approach where active management involves removing those trees, as we're doing now throughout our wildlife management areas in North Jersey, thinking that that's going to be better for climate is just not right. And again, we're not going to get a young forest coming back unless you're going to spend millions of dollars on deer fencing and invasive species removal. So I really hope that this can be reconsidered as an approach. It does not fit in with our desire to ameliorate climate change. Thank you.
Okay, so you have made a lot of points in there, so I want to try and address as many of them as I can. You mentioned the creation of early forests and cutting mature forests. Neither of those things are things that we're recommending specifically in here. So I just want to make sure that that's clear. We're not looking to create a ton of early successional habitat, and we're also not looking to cut mature forests down for the sake of cutting them down. For thinning, again, any thinning that we do is going to be for the purpose of fire mitigation. Again, a lot of that's going to be done specifically in South Jersey. And that's a way to, we would do thinning for safety for our firefighters, safety for people living in and around our pine moons forests, for southern pine beetle prevention. Thinning down to at least 80 square feet is a really well-known and studied management method for combating southern pine beetle invasions. And most of the thinnings that we are doing in the Pine Barrens for wildfire mitigation projects are to remove those ladder fuels. So we're doing low thinnings, and that wood is mostly staying on site. Then, whereas forest products are concerned, it's a little unrealistic to think that there's going to be no demand for wood products. The bigger the demand, the greater the leakage impact. But it's also unrealistic to think that New Jersey can support the full demand for forest products or wood products in the state. But we could try and keep some of that demand partially local. Now, I'd like to think that these recommendations and targets are a little bigger than just New Jersey's carbon. The Natural Working Lands is a function of the U.S. Climate Alliance, which was formed to help states to commit to achieving the Paris Agreement, which is a more global effort. So it's my hope that our targets could attempt to reach further than the borders of our state, where it makes sense to, and minimizing carbon leakage through using more local products and limiting emissions associated with transporting a lot of those goods can be a good place to start. So again, not trying to cut down all of our forests to create a products market here, but where it makes sense for there to be products associated with management, that'd be a really great way to help decrease leakage.
If I could just make a quick follow-up comment, I understand what you're saying, but what we're seeing now today in our public forest lands in northern New Jersey is way beyond thinning. It's very heavy logging, and it's even thinning. It's not going to give us a release from competition because of the deer and the invasive species, but we're seeing very heavy clearing. It's being called thinning, and I'm a forester by my master's is in forestry, my PhD in ecology. I know these different systems like seed tree and shelter wood sound very good, but what we're seeing is devastation of century-old trees being clear-cut. The logs are taken off-site instead of left for their carbon, and this practice is not a good idea for carbon defense, certainly not for a future forest, because again, we aren't getting any trees back. So I understand that you're saying thinning is only in South Jersey with the fire ecology. I get that, that's fine, but let's be realistic about what's happening right now. Is not a good idea for climate defense. So thank you for your thoughtful responses, but I just have to emphasize that we have a problem right now that really should change. Thank you.
Hey, thanks, Sarah. This is Bill Zipsey with New Jersey Forest Service, and I appreciate your comments on this. And Sarah makes a good point about the language. I think there is a little bit of confusion how the term thinning is being used, and on both sides, even some on the DEP side sometimes too. When I just want to make it clear, when a trained forester uses the term thinning, and you can hold me to this, when a trained forester uses the term thinning, what that means in silvicultural terms, meaning the science of growing forests, thinning is referring to that the growth in that forest, in that stand where you've done that activity, is still mainly in trees that occur on the site. That's where the growth is being concentrated to. So if somebody cuts something else and says that's a thinning and you don't see that occurring, that is not a thinning by definition. So I want to make that very clear. And if they're thinning it way back and they're not, the site is not being, and you see new growth coming in, which has to do with this whole biometric relationship. If you see new vegetation coming in very thickly and the trees aren't taking AK like invasive species, that growing space is being occupied, that is still not a thinning. So I just wanted to make that very, very, very clear as we move forward. Thanks.
And I guess, sorry, I'll jump in real quick too. And I just want to, say that we at the DEP and the Forest Service in particular, we do value forests of all age classes. And I hear what you're saying about older growth, older successional age classes of forests. And I think that those are tremendously, beneficial in our fight against climate change. So, I think what we're looking for in this strategy is, again, having the ability to provide a diverse management opportunity and focus on our forests. In places where ecological function is high and the forests are of an older age class and things are on a really good trajectory, we want to be able to perpetuate those and keep those forests growing older. And in places where invasives or deer pressures are impacting the forest, we want to have the ability to focus on the issues of those forests. And I agree that having a diversity of age classes, a diversity of forest structure is going to be really important as we move forward in combating climate change. So I think what we're looking at here is a list of strategies that I think, unless you can contextualize them around a stakeholder table and around a parcel and around a forest in particular, I think that's where the real discussion takes place in terms of which of these strategies are appropriate on which piece of forest and which piece of land. And maybe that monitoring and managing that forest through monitoring and treating invasives is appropriate in certain instances. And I think we also need to recognize that forests of all age classes provide benefits to different parts of the system. So just being able to have that represented across it is a really balanced approach. And I think we would welcome working together around the stakeholder table in terms of where to apply some of these things.
Thank you, Todd. I'm going to move on to the next hand raise. It looks like Kristen will be up next. And Kristen, you'll need to turn your mic on as well.
Yes. Yeah, hi everyone. This is Kristen Meistrel with New Jersey Audubon. So I just, I have a couple of clarifying questions and then a suggestion for moving forward. I will say too, I appreciate the thoughtfulness in, all the recommendations and the presentation, right? I think it's really important that we, one, recognize our forests as an important piece to climate mitigation, but also not solely relying on our forests to save us from climate mitigation, right? Especially when we have so many other different, our forests play so many different roles, from ecosystem services to, a variety of other things. So trying to balance all of that out, I think that's really important and a, welcome balanced approach to all of this. So the clarifying questions I had was when you talked about 1,500 acres per year in the thinning aspect, right? So my understanding is based on the FIA data, the U.S. Forest Service estimates roughly, right, 2,000 acres a year are thinned or harvest. And I don't know what the breakdown is between private lands and public lands. So is this the 15,000 acres sort of in addition to that?
So the 1,500 acres is essentially that, like you said, that number does not take into account private lands.
Yep.
I don't have stats for that. But that 1,500 acres, again, is limited because there are so few contractors in the state that are able to perform these things. And those contractors are being used by multiple agencies. So from the state lands perspective, 1,500 acres is about all we can manage with the resources that we currently have.
Okay, yeah, I appreciate that. So the other question, right? So you've talked quite a bit, particularly about pine barrens, but is there been any considerations in terms of the process of mesification, particularly in our northern forests, where we're seeing the shift in species from oaks and hickories to more shade tolerant species that may not be beneficial or fare well in our future climate conditions. So has there been kind of consideration of that?
Yeah, that's a really good point. I don't think that we took that fully into consideration in this first round of recommendations, but I'm really glad you mentioned that because that is something that we should definitely be considering, especially when it comes to thinking about shifting species ranges and climate adaptability of specific species.
Yeah,
hey, I just wanted to interject on that, Kristen, about mesification, because there is some specific language about that in the State Forest Action Plan, even though it's not in the NWLS portion of that specifically. And it is something we are monitoring and looking at and kind of coming up with metrics to figure out like what sort of developments we see on the ground merit what kind of response. So we're looking at things like the change in species importance values and the composition of the forest, and that does get complex because like deer populations do factor into that. And but that is something we are actually looking at, and mesification does have a section in the Forest Action Plan.
Excellent. Thank you. And then just the last sort of suggestion I would look at, and I made the same point for the tidal and wetland, or the tidal and non-tidal wetlands working group, is just right. I think overall we need to think about streamlining the process for moving projects along, right? So as a land manager and being deeply invested in, habitat restoration, there are a lot of different pieces that need to be reviewed, checked, and, those are all very important pieces that, right, we need to be looking at, right? We need to make sure we're following best management practices for wetlands, and we need to be, following different rules, but just trying to streamline that process, because it can be very, very challenging to move some of these projects along with our current regulatory processes.
Kristen, I'll chime in there. We do have an Office of Permit Coordination that's really well known for bringing together all of the permitting groups and kind of helping get through those hurdles, at least at the state level. So if that's something that you might benefit from, I can help connect you with them after the call.
Yeah, that'd be great. Thank you.
Sure. All right, there's another question in the chat from Tom Gilbert, and Tom asked, have we considered the recommendations of the Forest Stewardship Task Force? And I know that report was relatively recent. We've had some conversations about it internally, especially about the deer piece that came up recently. Todd, I don't know if you want to say something about that. You know, where does that fit in here?
I think, definitely that the recommendations of the task force are something that we have all certainly read and taken into consideration, but because they're still open for public comment, I think I'm going to leave that question there.
That makes sense. Thank you. All right, Leslie has a hand raised. We're going to go ahead and.
Oh, before
allow
you
your-
do that, Heather, Tom Gilbert was wondering if he can elaborate.
Sure, let's see. All right, Tom, your mic is available if you turn it on. So Tom, we're seeing that your mic is active, but I'm not hearing you. Yeah, it appears active in the chat, but we're not getting your audio. Sorry about that. If you think you have it, raise your hand again then, okay? We'll come back to you. All right, let's move on to Leslie Sauer. All right, Leslie, you should be able to turn your mic on now.
It says unmuting.
You're good now.
Okay, great. Yeah, I wanted to ask, given that older trees store the greatest amount of carbon, I was curious why there was virtually no specific protection for older trees, especially on public lands, given that this is where the greatest storage is. I think if you had great success with all your recommendations, with the thinning and the replanting, that she would actually be net carbon negative, except for the fact, for decades, except for the fact that the existing trees are expanding their carbon sequestration and storage. And I think that a great concern of many of us who have been involved in the task force and a lot of these different discussions is how can we better protect our existing public forests from loss of carbon storage. And one of the things that I see in all of these is that the reports all kind of tend to be circular. They refer to each other, but everybody leads out any serious protection of larger trees in public lands. The closest we come is, as Bill put it out, getting a mini reference to proforestation. But as you recall, Bill, that was quite a struggle to get even that little bit in. And I think there's just a fundamental prejudice against protecting our public forests from logging, especially logging of larger trees, and that it would be more effective than everything you have in this entire report combined. Thank you.
Leslie, thank you for that. Lauren, there is a target for avoided conversion. Would you say that that touches on this?
So
No.
I'd say that we have, like you said, Leslie, we don't have a specific recommendation that is specific to mature trees or protecting more mature old growth forests. But it's something that, like I said, again, forestry is very site specific. So when we were writing plans, the decision to not manage an area, to leave it, to preserve things like that is still considered an active management decision to us. So I feel that that could fall under several things, like Heather said, avoided conversion, improved forest management. So I feel that a target related to that could fall under one of these broader recommendations. And it's something that we can definitely consider.
All right, let's go on to Jacqueline next. So Jacqueline, your mic should be available.
Thank you. Can someone define what is ecological forestry? And if you do or have the definition or don't, will there be an opportunity to either define it or refine it?
Yeah, so I actually figured we might get a question like this, so I went ahead and pulled the definition of ecological restoration from the Society of Ecological Restoration. So ecological restoration is defined as the process of assisting the recovery of an ecosystem that has been degraded, damaged, or destroyed.
Okay, but that's restoration, not forestry, which I would perceive to be something different. So will there be an opportunity to actually define this as part of this overall strategy?
I'm sorry, I think I'm a little confused. I thought you had been asking for the definition of ecological restoration. What is the definition that you're looking for?
The term ecological forestry was used.
Ecological forestry. Okay, yeah, we can definitely pull a definition for that for you. I don't have one on hand right now, but that's something that I will write down and we can get back to you on.
I can elaborate a little bit on that.
Yeah,
so,
absolutely, Bill. Thank you.
Generally, when we talk about ecological forestry, it means that the focus of the objectives of the forestry activities are on maintaining or mimicking ecological processes that are current in that ecosystem. It also means basing your activity scheduling based on like historic disturbance regimes. A lot of the principles now that we tend to refer to, at least I can't speak for all of DEP on this, but what my agency tends to concentrate on for ecological forestry, we use a lot of the principles published by Jerry Franklin in his recent book on ecological forest management. I'm sorry, I don't have the reference in my back pocket, but I'm happy to share it with you. Jacqueline, I know where to find you too, and for anybody else that's out there, I guess we could post that for. I'll look it up and put it in the chat.
Thank you.
But yeah, I wanted to point that out that in a nutshell, those are the principles underpinning it.
Tom said that his microphone he thinks is working, Heather.
I was just thinking the same thing. Tom, let's go ahead and get you on now.
Okay, trying it again. Can you hear me this time?
Perfect.
Oh, good, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say a little bit more about some of the task force recommendations that I think are important to this conversation. And Lauren, early on, I heard mention that the sort of when and where these things occur is important, which I agree. And Todd talked about getting the stakeholders around the table, which I also think is important. And I think one of the things that we concluded in the Forest Stewardship Task Force process is that we don't really have the mechanisms in place currently to really do those things adequately. We really don't have the comprehensive science-based planning across our forests to really be able to evaluate what makes sense to do where, nor do we really have the processes consistently in place to really bring the stakeholders around the table to evaluate that. And so, I'd have to sort of disagree with Kristen Maestro about streamlining the process, unless we're sort of talking about apples and oranges there. I think the processes are not adequate, and that was one of the recommendations of the task force. And I would have to mention the recent clearing of 21 acres of mature forests in Glassboro Wildlife Management Area as an example of that, where there was no public input and there was clearly not a sufficient internal review process to prevent what we feel is clearly damage to protected wetlands and rare plants. And so I just think a lot of these strategies will fall short if we don't have more comprehensive science-based planning to undergird these decisions about what makes sense to do where. And if we don't have more robust processes to really bring people around the table to make sure we've thought through all of these trade-offs, right? I mean, that we're not creating habitat for a game species in mature forests and losing all of the carbon there. We feel confident there are many other places where woodcock habitat could be created without having to make that carbon trade-off, right? That loss of carbon that resulted by doing that in an inappropriate location. So it's sort of this context that's missing with more comprehensive planning and thorough processes that I think is going to be essential to make a lot of these things work, frankly. Thank you.
Thanks for the comment, Tom. I believe up next we have Matt Olson. We'll go ahead and allow your mic if you want to turn that on.
Hello, can you hear me now?
You're good. Great.
Well, first of all, I just want to say thank you. I really appreciate all your hard work and effort in pulling this together and just giving a really clear presentation. So I'm Matt Olson. I'm at Stockton University. I'm an assistant professor here. My background's in forestry. And, one thing that I just want to I guess, get your input on is, I noticed that you specifically mentioned thinning practices. And it just seemed like the focus is really for fuels reduction in southern New Jersey, and then also just reducing stresses on trees and things like that as well. I just wonder if it's just kind of what you also had in mind. It's not just specific to South Jersey, but also thinking about northern New Jersey and some of the issues that we have with trying to basically regenerate and sustain oak recruitment in our northern forests. I just wonder if you also have in mind that perhaps through these recommendations that you would also, I guess, recommend implementing silvicultural practices specifically for regenerating oak and sustaining the recruitment in our northern New Jersey forests. I'll just leave it at that. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that could definitely be a good addition. The thinning was kind of the main focus in there because it was listed under an avoided emissions category. So trying to prevent our forests from going up in smoke from wildfires or from being killed off by southern pine beetle. So that's why thinning was specifically called out in that recommendation, because thinning is directly applicable to fire mitigation and southern pine beetle mitigation. But yeah, definitely a good point that we can definitely take North Jersey more into account and some of the regeneration issues that we're having up there.
And I will point out that oak regeneration is also referred to in the New Jersey State Forest Action Plan as well, even though it's not as specifically mentioned in the NWLS targets.
Hey, Bill, I'm just going to jump in real quick. A lot of folks in the comments are seeing other commenters coming up under their name. I don't think that's what we're seeing on our end. I'm seeing the folks that are raising the concerns, and there aren't multiple comments coming through. So just rest easy that, there's some glitch occurring. But as far as, when we're calling on people, I think everything is lining up the way that it should. So let's go ahead and call on Jean next. All right, Jean, you should be able to turn your microphone on now.
I wanted to point out that our forests are under a lot of stress from a lot of other reasons besides nature and deer. We have to take all of that into account, like acid rain, invasive viruses, invasive species, massive invasive species, massive chemical use, which is all over New Jersey, including PFOA and PFAS, and diminished sunlight, lack of snowpack, which also influences roots. The high human use of our forests is also a factor in what happens to the soil in the forests, so that it's packed and can't grow. So that we have many, many factors besides the ones I have mentioned that are influencing forest growth. And we can't forget about them. And in fact, a lot of these invasive viruses and species are a result of the USDA not doing their job in keeping them out of the USA. So that you're working with the Department of Agriculture, and they're part of the problem. They have let in these species from foreign lands that are marauding, like the lanternfly now. So our forests are under stress, and it's because of some of the human actions of our government that have caused that. And I'd like that to be part of what is causing our forests to have problems in reforesting? Thank you for listening.
Thanks, Jean. I definitely agree. There are a lot of good points that you make there about other stressors to our forests. And I think that we can identify a lot of those things under our forest restoration and reforestation target, where we're aiming to identify degraded lands and see how we can restore them to ecologically functioning states.
All right, thank you. We'll move on to Donald next.
Hello, can you hear me?
You're good.
Okay. Actually, I had 2 points. The first one is really builds upon what Matt Olson brought up, that topic. So I won't belabor it, except to say that I think the issue of thinning, when you focus and I feel like the Forest Service did this in the Forest Action Plan as well, focusing on South Jersey. And I understand the reason for that with the fire hazard and the fuel issue. But by doing that, it also implies that the same principles of competition and resiliency and tree vigor and stress don't apply to hardwood thinning. And that's not true. It leaves, a big part of the population under the feeling that there's never a need or a benefit for thinning hardwoods, even besides oak. And this goes beyond just for regenerating oak. This is just to reduce tree stress and improve vigor and resiliency. So I think it's important, as you discuss this, to couch these discussions in the fact that you may be targeting South Jersey because of the fuel component that places at a higher priority, but really the principles of thinning a forest may apply equally from a resiliency standpoint throughout all our landscapes. So no need for you to reply to that, but the second, I guess, point or question I have is, in your recommendations under what are presumably forestry recommendations, you include avoided conversion and a discussion of, maybe getting to 2,000 acres a year through some forestry action for avoided conversion. And you have a separate line item for increased acreage land purchased by Green Acres. So I'm wondering if those 2 items are independent of each other, the Green Acres acquisition and your minimized conversion. What is your strategy to actually minimize conversion besides enrolling people in a stewardship plan program, which doesn't seem to align with 2,000 acres a year?
Yeah, that's a really great question. Like I hope I mentioned when I was giving the presentation on avoided conversion, that recommendation and those targets are kind of a lot bigger than the DEP because, it's hard to, figure out how to get other folks to keep their forests as forests. And so, yeah, I think that the increase in like Green Acres land purchasing is definitely an aspect of that avoiding conversion, and trying to keep municipalities and private landowners enrolled or starting to enroll in our programs is another way to deter conversion. But again, it's a really tough thing to try and plan for and to set targets for, unfortunately.
So just building upon that, if I look at the 8050 report, there are calculations on how maybe in the case of sequestration, you're going to actually achieve the carbon goals under what are presumed forestry actions. And I would thought that your proposed actions that you're outlining today were calculated and aligned with what was in the 8050 report to kind of meet those million metric ton goals. But what you're saying is these are just hypothetical strategies, and these aren't actually, you haven't done mathematical calculations to say that, for example, if you plant 200 acres a year and you achieve all these things, that you're actually going to meet those carbon sequestration goals in the report. This is just kind of more theoretical. Is that right?
Donald, that's right. If we were to include all the calculations in this round, I think this strategy probably would be another 2 years in the making. So we thought it best to identify practices that can make progress towards those goals. And then once we start getting in motion, we'll line up the calculations.
Okay, thank you.
Also, Don, just in response to that as a follow-up too, I'd just like to respond to that a little bit. It doesn't mean that we don't have calculations though, and we have an idea of the order of magnitude on that. Definitely the situation's pretty complex on the ground. So for instance, the development pressure, change in the economic conditions, I even think because we're dealing with some of these calculations when the action plan was being put together in 2020, and just sort of the change and the impacts of that since 2020, thinking about what's happened with that. So yeah, we have some ideas like in terms of like what the carbon pools look like, what growth rates look like, where we're taking losses in the state, and what those look like in terms of the orders of magnitude. But yes, it is not calculated down to like a specific like block and saying what the trade-off is. When we do activities internally, we do know that. Yeah, in terms of it's more along the lines of orders of magnitude, but I don't want to leave that out there like it's completely hypothetical. It's not.
Okay, thanks.
Thanks, Bill. All right, let's move on to Elliot. But before we call on you, I just want to reassure folks on the chat, we are not seeing comments coming from you that were not from you. Richard K said that person is seeing comments under their name. The hosts are not seeing it that way. Just wanted to put that out there again. All right. It looks like, sorry, having a glitch here. Like Elliot is up next. Go ahead.
Yes, Elliot Ruga, New Jersey Highlands Coalition. I have two clarifying questions regarding mesification. I understand the negative impacts to wood product values, but I haven't seen any hard data that it has any impact on climate resiliency. Can you comment on that?
I could give you some the short answer to that. If I didn't mean to interrupt you, but since we mentioned this in the action plan, the short answer to that is mesification refers to when the condition of a forest leads to shade tolerant species that tend to use more water than the existing overstory species start to replace those the species that conserve water more. And what happens is some of these species, it's not every forest, but mesification refers to, the forest starts drying out because you have these trees that utilize more water growing in underneath the understory of certain forests that have species like oak species that use less water than things like sweet birch. Northern hardwoods are a good example of this, that are more adapted, by name northern hardwood. They're hardwood species that are adapted to more northerly climes. So maybe the condition on the ground makes that how that forest is growing back more suitable to those species, the water guzzling species. But the reality is the climate conditions in the future are actually acting against them. An example would be like certain abandoned fields in, say, for a North Jersey example, during the 1940s, when people left farms for World War II, came back to manufacturing jobs, the field would regenerate. You might have some oaks, and then you have these other species coming in, and some of that looks like sweet birch. Some of that looks like succession, but some of that has to do with how the land was left and then how the place was resettled when people came back. So what happens is the shade tolerant species take over because the site conditions favor that, but the climatic conditions do not. And I think that's what people are referring to. And there have been some studies on this. I don't have them in my back pocket for this, but I can look them up. And there, we did refer to some of this in the Forest Action Plan. We've also been working with the U.S. Forest Service Research Station on some of this, again, looking at what they call species importance value, which has to do with how in the current climate, how different species will fare under competition, and then you take a modeled climate into the future using climate change projections and seeing how those different species fare and how that forest is adapted to future climate conditions. So when we talk about mesification, that's what they're referring to.
Okay. I'm not sure that answered my question. Is there a negative impact on the forest's ability to capture and store carbon?
Yes. So what happens is there have been some instances of this in the in like some of the lake states, where basically what happens is you have forests grow in where their trees are not well adapted to warmer climates and longer growing seasons. So like, for instance, I'm trying to think of specific species here. Northern, well, sweet birch, paper birch in parts of the growing at more southerly climates, where those longer growing seasons actually make those trees are vulnerable to certain types of insect pests, or the climate is more conducive to another species. And even though the species that are there have colonized the site, you wind up with slower growth rates or mortality events, as the water supply can't sustain the species that are currently growing there. Because again, it was site conditions that favored those species being there, or other conditions that favored them, and not really the evolutionary environment that they're currently growing under. So you wind up, what happens is the growth slows down, or you have mortality events.
Okay,
Increased frequency and intensity. No, thanks. That's a good question.
Thank you, Bill.
Thanks.
My other question is regarding carbon leakage, and it's irresponsible to import wood products from Indonesia to New Jersey, but it's not necessarily irresponsible to import from Pennsylvania or Vermont. And I'm wondering if our goal is to be responsible. Can we satisfy whatever local wood product demand we have in New Jersey by neighboring states and private land in New Jersey, not necessarily looking at our public lands as a source of wood products?
I would say that looking at wood products and forest products from neighboring states is a great way to start helping to reduce that global carbon leakage impact. I also want to just throw out there that for the Forest Service, at least, whenever we're implementing inventory, it is never with the priority or goal of getting timber from that. Occasionally, harvested wood is a byproduct of a management that we're implementing, but that's never the goal or the priority. I think that private lands could have an opportunity to be working in different forest product markets in the state. That could be beneficial to us. But yeah, I think that could be a good start. It's just making our wood products more local to us.
Great. Okay, thank you.
All right, we're going to move on to Ken next, but before we do that, just in case anybody needs to get going off the call, I want you to know where we're going from here and how to reach us after the meeting if you need to provide comments or questions. This is our last stakeholder meeting. We are looking for written comments by April 14th. There is some talk of extending that deadline. That hasn't happened yet, though. You can check our website, which is this link at the bottom. That's where the targets are listed. That's where we're going to post the webinar recordings and the PowerPoint slides, and any updates will be available there. So if you go to that link, the full list of targets for all of the land types here are in this document called Draft NWLS Targets, and that will open as a PDF for you. And then to provide comments, further down on the same page here is a field comment on NJ's NWLS stakeholder sessions. And that will be a drop down, couple fields there. It'll come into DEP. We can take a look at it, see if we can integrate it into our strategy. So I will stop talking now and we'll turn it over to Ken. And Ken, your mic is available. Go ahead. If you're able to turn it on your end. We're not getting your sound, Ken, but if you click on the microphone icon, that should unmute it. All right, sorry, Ken, we're still not hearing you. If you're able to resolve it, put your hand back up and we're going to move on to John next. And John, you'll need to turn your mic on.
Hello?
We can hear you.
Can you hear me?
You're good.
This has been really exciting. I'm a grad student focusing on forest ecology with strong ties to New Jersey. So this is just, I know there's a lot of discussion and disagreement, but this is really cool talking about forests. I was wondering if I know this is broadly focused on how we can increase the carbon storage of the state by 2050. Wondering what the capacity for increasing forested land in the state is. I know you talked about that a little bit, but I wonder if you have any numbers on like what you think is possible. And then this part isn't really, I don't know how it ties into increasing the carbon storage, but fragmentation is definitely a problem for forests, and I wonder if that's something that would be highlighted in reforestation projects. And thank you very much.
Yeah, those are really great questions. I don't have a ton of numbers off the top of my head for land that would potentially be available to a forest. Again, that would be pretty site specific, making sure that like soil conditions and things like that are correct for planted trees, and making sure that those lands aren't being used for other ecological purposes, that we're not taking away functioning agricultural lands. So we would definitely need to work with the Department of Agriculture to kind of figure out what kind of, how much old or abandoned farm fields are in existence that we could potentially assess for afforestation potential. Abandoned golf courses, cranberry bogs, things like that are on our list of things to check out and assess for that potential as well. And what you said with fragmentation, again, a really great point. We do have a target that talks about working with the Connecting Habitats Across New Jersey program, the CHANGE program. That program highlights core and connecting habitats and corridors that wildlife tend to use. And that's something that we would like to take into great consideration when we're talking about afforesting different lands.
And also, if I can, one more thing, I guess this is more of a big picture about like marketing the value of forests to the state to maybe reach all types of stakeholders, whether they be more in mind of timber as a resource rather than as a beautiful thing, like just marketing the value of the forest to our state, which many people might not think of when they think of what our state has to offer. So I guess some arm of the goal to increase the visibility of the forests, whether they're young, old, or what have you, might help increase the carbon stock somehow.
Yeah, definitely. We have that big outreach recommendation that we tried to kind of sprinkle in a bunch of ideas similar to what you're talking about in there, because we do realize that there are a lot of developed spaces in New Jersey where people do not have easy access to forested lands, and they're not getting visibility. They don't know that they exist or haven't been able to experience them. So being able to provide outreach and opportunities for people to see some of our forests is definitely a really big deal in getting people to, you know, respect our forests, understand forest ecology and the value of having forests and carbon, and just get them more interested and understanding the importance of those things. So definitely a great point.
Thank you, John. Let's move on to Sylvia. Sylvia, you can turn your mic on now.
Sylvia said it's in the chat that it's not allowing her to unmute. You want to try?
Okay, give that one more try, Sylvia. It should be okay now.
The microphone button should be in the top right of the screen.
Yeah, Sylvia, we're still not getting anything. Sorry about that. We'll try you and Ken again after we get through these next few folks, but if you're unable to speak, you can go ahead and enter it in the chat, please. All right, let's move on to Nick. All right, you should be able to turn on your microphone now, Nick. Sorry, folks, I'm not sure what's going on here. We are giving, microphone privileges, but I can see that you're not able to speak at this point. If you click on the microphone icon, it should allow you to turn it on. We did say enable mic on our end. All right, let's try Emil next, and then I'm wondering if this isn't working out. So Emil, you go ahead and try to turn your microphone on.
How's that?
You're good.
Just a quick comment about you were talking about cranberry bogs and regenerating forest. So if anybody wants, NJCF can set up a tour of our 800 acres of early successional habitats and young forest made out of the former cranberry bogs in Chatsworth. That's a lot of acres. And there, more generally, Green Acres money has purchased state lands throughout New Jersey, and the Green Acres program and also county parkland and municipal parkland farms that have been purchased with Green Acres money, not farmland preservation money. And the Green Acres program says to the counties and municipalities, well, you can have them be mowed until you come up with a plan for them. Well, most people just continue to lease them to farmers, and they just stay as farmland with neonics and Roundup. And so we spent Green Acres money so somebody can keep poisoning the land, which should stop. As far as our state-owned lands, the same thing is going on. Rancocas State Park, right on the Rancocas River, you have acre upon acre of magnificent fertile soil that could be converted back to riparian forest and floodplain forest. And what is it? It's neonic crops kept mowed. And that's repeated on Division of Fish and Wildlife land, state parks and state forests all over the state. So, and also there's the cranberry bogs by Lakehurst, the old, for Pete's sakes, the Lippman cranberry bogs. They can all be converted back to young forest like crazy, right? To make, everybody talks about needing young forest. Well, we have the opportunity to make young forest everywhere on state lands purchased with Green Acres money. And we're not doing it because somebody doesn't want to upset the Department of Agriculture and the Farm Bureau. So get real, convert all that land back to forest and stop tippy-toeing around as if we have to worry about farmers when we're facing climate change, growing soybeans and corn and other stuff that we don't need. Thank you.
Hey, actually, there's one thing I thought our email. I was in the process of actually typing a reply because I saw the cranberry thing, and I wasn't sure if the mics were going to work. So, no, actually, I don't know if you remember. I thought you were going to mention General Permit 23 from like 20 years ago, where yeah, when there were ag permits going out, some of that money was used to like restore forests on like old cranberry bogs and stuff. That was yeah that's actually that's a pretty interesting idea. And I saw somebody mentioned, yeah, alternatives to like fee simple. And like, yeah, that General Permit 23 actually enabled a lot of early cedar experimentation and a lot of early cedar restoration efforts here in New Jersey nearly 20 years ago. Like New Jersey was really a pioneer state, and part of that had to do with how that operated. It was a structure for being able to fund some of that and some of that experimenting on things like old abandoned cranberry farms. No, thanks. Thought that was really interesting. Sorry.
All right, thank you both. Let's move on to Kathy. Kathy O'Leary, you should be able to turn your mic on now.
All right, that seemed to work.
You're good.
All right, I just want to point out, first of all, there's been a lot of discussion about Green Acres lands. There's nothing preventing the municipalities, whoever's in possession of the Green Acres lands, from converting what is forested land to fields, to any kind of recreational activity, as long as it remains open space. So there's nothing about deforestation, preventing deforestation in any in Green Acres regulations. I'm curious why wood being in landfills is an issue. Do you have any data on how large of a problem this is? Doesn't seem to be a problem to dispose of wood, whether through chipping or otherwise. And also, and the reason why that concerns me is that this idea that we need to create a more robust local market for wood. This is one of the things that's being used as for that. So yeah, so I really would like to know if you have any numbers in terms of how much wood is ending up in landfills, when really the assumption should be that wood should be, that if you are doing a management plan that calls for thinning, that the wood primarily should be left in place to decompose, particularly from a carbon sequestration standpoint. My other question is, do we have any numbers on how much land is currently being converted? If our definition of conversion is from forest land to deforested land, which the shelter wood and seed tree harvests that are occurring on primarily on our wildlife management areas is going to fall under that. Do we have any idea of how much currently is being converted? I've been able to find stewardship plans all over the state for habitat management, not just for the great golden winged warbler, but also for bobwhite quail and her other game species. So I really would be interested in hearing that. And then we really can't ignore that whether or not it is your goal to generate revenue from these plans, that the ability to generate revenue from these plans is a motivator for landowners, public or private, to deforest, to remove wood, to do timber harvests. And then just interesting that Emil pointed out, we're talking about cranberry bogs, because one of the plans that I came across was Pine Creek or Pine Island cranberry farms down in South Jersey that is using a forest stewardship plan to harvest Atlantic white cedar. So I really wish somebody would that we would do some more data gathering in terms of what our current policies are already doing before we say we should do more of it. So thanks. Hopefully you have some answers for me.
I can shed some light on the landfill question, if that helps. So as far as wood from landfills, there was a national study looking at how much goes into landfills, and then there's regional allometry, like equations that can be used to estimate that. So on the forest side of things, the traditionally defined forest, we have estimates of that, and then we have models that can make estimates of like how much is estimated to go to landfills, aside from, of course, if there were activities on state lands, and obviously we generally don't send wood to landfills on our properties, but we can make estimates of where that wood is going. Now, the proportions of that are different in the urban forestry world, and the numbers for that are much fuzzier. So a lot of the time, the best estimates we have from that come from some of the reporting under New Jersey's laws. A lot of the time, wood waste is treated as solid waste. So we can get some statistics from solid waste and get an idea of what that looks like. Particularly, like there were numbers that came out after Hurricane Sandy, and we were able to make some estimates, and we built some allometry to be able to make those estimates. So that's where primarily most of those numbers come from. Even in the private lands programs in New Jersey, like there's no submission of like receipts of where everything is going. So it's basically there's a system of plots and there's measurements taken, and those even occur on private lands. And then we look at that and we can impute and use allometry to figure out how much of that went to landfills based on a subset of those being taken, measured, and then looking at actual receipts from landowners and seeing where things wound up. I hope that helps clarify it. So yes, it's an imputed result. It's a statistically imputed result. I don't know if that helps, but I wanted to cover that part because I was thinking about that when you asked that question. And then converted land, I will throw out there in terms of one of our big concerns right now is just the development rate and what's going on with that. And that we actually rely on a couple of different sources, but we've been using an academic source with Rutgers that looks at land use cover changes.
I just want to stop you there because I'm not talking about converted land in terms of development. I'm talking about converted lands because of habitat management projects and forest stewardship plans. So whether we're doing, I mean, like I said, I've been doing research. I have lots and lots of these plans I was able to find, some through OPA, some just public. And it is both private lands and public lands, but you know, how much of our forest is being converted because of habitat management projects.
Okay, I should talk a little bit about the metrics on that. Also, as you know, on public lands, well, private lands, there is a report filed every year if they're getting it when they get the tax break. So there is some knowledge in terms of what's going on there. If they're converting it out of forested use, that's where that actually impacts the tax assessment on the private properties. That's on public land also. It's tracked similarly, but there are two different agencies doing that. So I can speak for my agency, but I can't speak for other agencies. But like, so we do track that number, and we actually don't do a lot of conversion on the Forest Service side of things. Generally, yeah, we're actually trying to promote more forest, not reduce the amount of forest statewide. But like I said, I don't speak for all of DEP.
So,
I guess, you know, when you think about conversion of forest on our side, it would be things like strategically located fire breaks or things like that that have a separate benefit for being non-forested at that point.
Yes.
And then on the private lands aspect, you know, they're taken out of, if they're converting forest from forest to non-forest through habitat work, there then would be removed from that stewardship plan and removed from the tax program.
I'm sorry, your mic cut out, but what I am specifically referring to is what was happening in Glassboro, what's happening currently. There's another cut about to happen on Sparta Mountain. So these are shelter wood harvests, right? Where you're taking 10 acres, 20 acres. I found a private plan in the Highlands where they were taking 50 acres in a shelter wood harvest. So are these things being tracked? And that would not be tracked by a change in taxes, because these are still considered forested lands, even though all the trees have been removed.
So things like habitat creation of grass fields or things like that, that would be a conversion. That's a forested, if that were to have come out of forest, that would be tracked as, as a conversion type from forest to non-forest. Things like shelter woods and seed tree cuts, those would be regeneration cuts, and those would still be maintained as forest, but they would be counted as, harvested acres. So I think depending on the different silvicultural practice, the different silvicultural technique in those sites, if they're accounted through different ways, they would not come up as the seed tree and shelter wood and the regeneration cuts would not be accounted for in that avoided conversion target.
So because we only have a few minutes left, I want to, Kathy, thank you for your questions and comments, and Todd, thank you for your response. Let's go to Ken, who I think is now on the 973 number, Heather. So I think, oh yeah, are you able to
Okay. I did allow the microphone. Let's try that again. I think we turned each other's off.
Yeah.
All right, I'm going to say allow mic now. And it's not working. Yeah, that's unfortunate. The phone number is not allowing the microphone.
So I'm sorry for the technical difficulties that we've been having today. But I do want to remind you that you can type, any kind of comments or questions you have in the chat, and also go to the website, which we'll post the link to again. And, after this meeting, you can type in any questions or comments that you have in there, and we'll be sure to consider them as we're going through the process of developing the strategy.
So we'll stay on for one more minute. Ken and Nick, we have your mics available on our end. If you are able to turn them on, go ahead and join us. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. We did share the link to the website where you'll find the webinar recordings. You'll find the PowerPoint slides. Look for those by the end of next week. Any updates will be there, in particular if we do extend the comment period deadline. But if you didn't get that link, just Google NJDEP NWLS. And we will comb through everything that was brought up today, make sure that we consider this as we're drafting the strategy. Thank you all for spending your precious time with us, and have a great afternoon. Take care.